Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pros and Cons, a podcast by emerging writers for emerging writers. And why do we call it Pros and Cons? We call it Pros and Cons because sometimes we feel like pros and sometimes we feel like cons. And that's very true on both sides, both accounts. Today, it's just it's a one-on-one. Welcome to the intimacy of a one-on-one conversation. I just went on a Dan Simmons journey over the last few months, per the recommendation of James, who I'm sat with here today. We're going to talk. There he is. We're going to talk Dan Simmons, cool things he's done and other things like that. So sit down, get comfy. Let's just chat a little bit. So James, would you like to say something about yourself a little bit? Introduce yourself to those who may not know or are just craving to hear it again.
Yes, exactly. I am James Healy. I'm an avid reader, particularly of horror and science fiction, and I'm a writer of science fiction and horror stories myself. So I really like kind of delving into and analyzing when I find a good book, and I like to read it over and over again and figure out why certain elements of it worked and why I was engaged with certain elements of it. And yeah, at the moment, Dan Simmons is one of my favorite authors. So yeah, I was delighted to get as much of the team reading Dan Simmons books as I could. And I was delighted when Phoenix suggested we do an episode about it.
Yeah, I was not an avid reader growing up, but I've become an avid reader later in life. And I don't know. It's weird. I wouldn't say I was an avid reader, but I had this weird appreciation for books. Even though I didn't read them often, even as a very little kid, something about them felt so quiet and so it felt like there was so much space in them. And I was fascinated by their covers. I was fascinated. I find myself even fascinated with just like how the words feel on the page. Like I had a very like sort of visceral, tactile connection to them that I've always very much so appreciated. And even today, there's something about the fact that I was just thinking about this, even though books are mass printed and so multiple people can enjoy them, your particular copy is your particular copy. And even though the exact words are reprinted, it's like your relationship with that exact print of that book, and like only you are sharing this connection with the particular word that you see in front of you. Like, yeah, it's a reproduced word, but that particular copy is physically represented only there and only with you. And I don't know why that really stuck. That's an example of how I think about books sometimes. I'm just like, wow, I'm the only one here looking at these words right now. It's just me and these words right here. And it's just this space just between us. And it feels so intimate and so quiet. And I love that so much.
Yeah. And then I find this in that same point, the strange thing about it is that it is kind of an intimate, solitary experience. But it's this intimate, solitary experience that like many people are probably having by themselves, if you know what I mean. So I think that's why people who've read similar books, they do tend to be like, oh my God, you read the book and you thought the same and you felt the same and you did the same, because you have so much. If it's a really good book, you might have so much. It might have given you so much when you were reading it. So when you meet someone else and they were like, I got so much too, and I loved it, and I like these twists and turns and stuff. So that can be a cool feeling too.
It feels like because it takes time to read, especially if you're diving into a pretty, there's some beefy novels out there. And when you really get sucked into them, it feels like, because, you're reading, it almost feels like in a way you're studying, and it's like I feel like I'm becoming an expert on a very specific thing, like on the plot of this book. So it is fun when you meet someone else and you can talk about it. And it's not the same with movies. Like you'll feel a kinship with movies, and obviously you can, discuss those too. But it is like, I spent a literal month reading this book. It's so glad, like I'm so happy I can, share my experience, this journey of a month with someone else and discuss it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just remind me, which you've read Hyperion, and have you read another Dan Simmons? Did you read The Terror, or were you still working on it? Oh, great.
No,
okay, cool.
I listened to The Terror. Yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay.
That was really funny. Because I know I either misheard or didn't know, but I thought you had said it was like a short story or like a fairly quick listen. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Like
Okay.
I'll pop it in and stuff. And then like I just felt
Massive.
like in the plot, yeah, it's massive. I felt in the plot, I was like, I feel like they're not really near the peak of this thing, like how where this thing's gonna go. And I looked at the every chapter was fairly beefy, and I looked at the chapter count, and there was like I don't know 30 something chapters, or I think way more actually, I think 60 something. I don't remember, but
Yeah.
I
And
was just
some of
like,
them are a
whoa,
good 3,000 words. Like the opening
yep,
chapter is like 3,000 words. Yeah. It's massive.
yeah, yeah. And then there was one in there that was like a 45-minute chapter. Like he has one behemoth in there. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
a deep dive on Crozier, the main character.
Yes.
Very necessary. Is a great chapter, but I was just like, whew. And what would you say? What would you say is your favorite work of his?
I would definitely say Hyperion is my favorite works of his. I think Hyperion might be my favorite book. My favorite fiction book. I
Mm,
think just because it has, again, just a quickly an explanation of it for the listeners.
hmm
So Hyperion is a story in which I think 7 or 8 characters are contacted somewhat randomly by this religious sect to come and do a pilgrimage. It's set in a future where human beings have kind of inhabited space and they live on all these different planets. So these characters essentially fly to this planet called Hyperion to go on this journey to this religious group's sort of their religious site, I guess. Um, and the belief of this religious group is that when you get there, you will meet a creature called the Shrike, which they worship as the Lord of Pain and Atonement, and he will grant one of the pilgrims a wish, any wish that they want, or it will grant one of the pilgrims any wish that they want, and will just horribly murder the other 7. So pretty bizarre setup, pretty wild. And the 7 characters on their journey, they end up kind of deciding to discuss why they're there and what their intention is in being there and stuff and what their plan is. So the story is actually broken up into partly a road trip story of these characters kind of traveling across this planet. But each of there's short stories within the book, and each of them is like kind of a look at that character's life and their big goal, their motivation for being there. And the thing I really liked about it was that each of the stories is broken up into like a different genre. So they're all science fiction, but one of them is horror, one of them is comedy, one of them is tragedy, one of them is action, one of them is like almost a crime mystery.
hmm
So I was just so impressed by that. Like each time I got to the next story, I was like, wow, he's nailing action and he's nailing comedy. And then there's this big emotional arc for a tragedy story, and I couldn't believe it. So I was really, really impressed by that. The fact that each of the characters' motivations make you really root for them, but it also, because of the setup of the story, it means that even though you're rooting for each of them, only one of them can really get what they want in the end, and it puts the others in conflict with each other. But despite this, they're kind of all working together to try to get through it. So it just gave it great pacing. It meant that you're always waiting to get to the next character story and stuff. So really exciting. And the whole time you're thinking, God, what's going to happen to them when they get to the end point. So yeah, it was a great book.
When I noticed that every story was such a distinctly different voice and distinctly different genre and all that, I was like, oh, now he's just showing off. Like it made me
That's
feel
exactly what it feels.
very,
Yeah.
like he does every single one so well. It was the first time I was properly intimidated by an author where I felt like that, like this is mastery of a craft on a different level, or just like he had just such fluency with it. It was wild, and every single one was so beautiful. And even when we got to the poet story, just like how out of nowhere he could just pull a ridiculously poetic description of something in a way that and he did it in such a way he did it in a way that I would say is a good way, where it was very he wasn't like randomly spouting poetry. I mean, he does have like random clips of poetry throughout the book, but during that chapter, he wasn't like randomly inserting poetry that made things too dense for a reader to understand. He just adjusted his voice so he was more poetically inclined in the way he described things. He just twisted it. He changed his voice a little bit to make it more poetic, but in a way where I still felt a very visceral connection with what he was describing. And every time he was describing something, I was like, oh my gosh, I know exactly what he's saying. And I feel it. He just said it in a more poetic way than he had in other chapters. I was just like, dang it. Like, come on, Daniel. This is
Yeah.
wild. Like you're
Back
a
up.
very good writer. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah. It was fascinating to like, that was the one for me that really made me say this is like really something. Because he has a great horror story earlier on, and then he has like a great like that was so poetic, but it was also, I remember I was laughing out loud when I was reading it. And I like, this is such a transition from like the tension I was feeling in the horror story to like going on this like kind of poetic journey with this rather like sardonic, sarcastic, cynical character, and kind of laughing away at the stuff that he was saying. I was like, I've never felt such a jump in a book. I know that you read books and they've got, this is the horror section, this is the funny section, and this is that. But this was like, here's a big long horror section, and now here's a big long funny poetic section. And I was like, this is, how did you do this?
Yeah. Oh man. And the tension in the horror story, like, okay, well, I'm transitioning thoughts as I'm saying this, but basically, it was crazy how every time I came out of a story, I was like, no, I don't like I got so attached to that story. I was like, oh, now I'm just supposed to read someone else's story. I don't care about this other person. But then I start reading that story and suddenly I'm invested. Like it did not take long for me to get invested in that one. And it
Yeah.
was just like, and it was wild how near the end, as you're getting through more and more of the stories, just you feel like I felt like I was collecting more people. Like now I have this, and it was just like more of the group suddenly becomes so much more fleshed out. And I had
Yeah.
such a connection with every single person, such a deep connection. It was the first time in a very long time where I was aware of myself getting close to the end of the book, and I knew I was going to be sad when it was over because I felt so invested with all the characters, and the world is so well defined. It was one of those very unique experiences, very special experiences where it really felt like a window to a fully different place, and I was going to miss having access to that window because it felt so much like anytime I opened it, I was just watching life play out. But obviously that ends when you get to the end of the book. You know, you run out of life to watch play out
Yeah.
because the words are done. But it's just very aware of that. And then it was really cool listening to I was actually listening to the Terror at the same time that I was reading Hyperion. Just another example of fully different voice. Dan Simmons, you're wild. Like that was, it didn't feel at all like Hyperion, but I could tell it was him. I
Mm.
would say it was because I was listening for it, I could find it. I don't know if I would have pulled that it was him had I not known because he's a chameleon, I guess, with
Yeah.
his voice. That was wild, but he has a certain way of describing things. He's a lover of detail in a way that I very much so appreciate. And I could kind of pick up on that same sense of, I guess, detail. There was a care for detail there that felt familiar.
Yeah, definitely. He's got kind of, I don't know what I'd say. I think probably the Terror and Hyperion, I think are probably his two most different books, the most different, because the Terror is like almost a historical fiction with kind of horror overtones and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a collection of books which are kind of just like straightforward horror, which kind of feel like you can kind of see a lot of Stephen King inspiration in them.
Okay.
Carrion Comforts is the best of those, definitely. That's another big book.
Oh, he loves the word carrion.
He says it. He says carrion Brett in every one of his books that I've read.
Yeah.
It always comes up. It's his favorite
That's
phrase.
how you know.
Yeah. And then he has a bunch of books that I'd say are kind of in they're probably more in the Hyperion realm. But what I feel like Hyperion was so good because he gradually developed that world. So it felt like it made sense. In some of his other science fiction books, he drops you right into the world where all the intense technology and I don't know how to describe it. Not magic, but like the crazy, crazy technology stuff and aliens and the different ways that the aliens function with the technology. All of this is just happening,
Mm. Oh
and you're
yeah.
thrown right into it. So it can be quite intense. Olympus is one that's like there's three different characters, but there's so much going on in each of the stories that I found it kind of hard to get into. Um,
Mm.
it's from the perspective of a character who I think probably lived in the modern age and has passed away, and his spirit has been reanimated in the past to be an observer of the Battle of Troy with Achilles and the gods and all this.
Whoa.
Yeah. So he is like essentially basically able to he seems to be observing this for eternity. So he's able to travel to different points and different times as he wants. But all of the gods are not really gods. They're just people with very advanced technology who are
Oh.
influencing the events. And that's just one of the character stories. There's two other characters. One of the characters is kind of like this alien creature that like crash lands, and you go with this creature as their plane is like crashing, or their spaceship, whatever, is crashing down into the planet. And then another character, which seems to be a clone in a some kind of like Jurassic Park, like theme park, where dinosaurs have eaten people and they just get reanimated once they die. And I was kind of like, how are these stories gonna link up? Really, really well written and like just incredibly detailed,
Mm-hmm.
but really like high concept, very high concept stuff.
So
And I found it funny
wow.
listening to him writing about the events of Achilles, because you can tell I kind of got the impression that Dan Simmons was made to like study Achilles in like school or college, and he just hated the story. So he's really, really ridiculing like Achilles as a character, and then ridiculing the way that the gods influence stuff. It was very funny.
Oh my gosh. So one, wow. So just one of the stories within that book was about a guy who had his soul reanimated at that time and was infinitely watching the story of the Battle of Troy play out.
Yeah, and he
That's
decides to
wild.
start breaking the rules and seeing if he can influence things and have it play out differently. Which is
Mm.
that's kind of the main story, but then you're jumping into these other two very, very different stories as well. Not very different, they're all science fiction stuff, but they just
Hmm.
feel like each of them is their own concept
Completely
that you
different
feel like
plot.
you would shape a book around. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you say that that one worked as well as Hyperion in how the stories tied together?
Um, I wouldn't. I know it's a two-parter, and I don't
Mm.
recall if the stories linked up in the first part of it. I don't recall that. I remember it. I remember finding it a little bit challenging because I felt like there
Mm.
was so much happening. I guess you're really hit over the head with all of the technology and how it's functioning at the same time.
Mm.
So I kind of found it a bit difficult to kind of not so much get grounded, but I found it a bit difficult to feel like I was understanding, if you know what I mean. Like with
Yeah.
Hyperion, you feel like you're brought along the whole time, and you understand how each thing fits together and how each thing works. Whereas with
Yeah.
this one, I was going to do something else now, and I'll have to be trying to figure out how that new system works, or how that new thing works.
Yeah.
But I still found it very enjoyable. Being familiar with the story of Achilles, even kind of like a little bit, I found it really
Hmm.
fun going through and meeting the different gods, and how Dan Simmons was interpreting the different gods and the
That's
different things
cool.
that played out. Yeah, that was fun.
That is cool. That was I really like thinking about or thinking on the fact like what each story in Hyperion contributes to the overall plot of the book because they are separate
Yeah,
stories, but they are all building the same world and adding
yeah,
to the same overarching plot. Something he does very incredibly well. And that I feel like maybe the fact that well, no, I don't know. He's very good at subtle world building over time. Like I felt like by the midpoint of the book, I don't know, even earlier, whatever, but there was a certain point where I just knew how the world worked and it made sense to me a
yeah,
lot. And maybe that's partially from the fact that he's having, I don't know, it felt like you just got different perspectives on the world, obviously, from the different characters, and they all spoke about the same concepts and how they individually related to them. And through those different views, I don't know, it felt also fleshed out. And it felt so real, I guess, because you had so many different voices speaking about it so casually. Like even someone
yeah,
like the scholar who was not very technologically inclined at all and had a life fairly similar to more his story was more the tone and everything and the setting was more akin to something we would relate to, very like not so much technology there, but even he kind of, knew these terms and knew they were out there. He just didn't relate to them. It just made it feel so much more grounded to have so many different perspectives on it all. But I like for example, the first story, or each story, obviously, yeah, you learn a lot about one of the characters, but also I feel like in each story you also learn some key piece about how the world works, or some key piece of significance for the ultimate thing that you're building up to. So like the first story, you learn about the priest character, but then he sets the tone for the mystery of the Shrike, and he quickly shows the reader some things that are very difficult to describe and are very, very otherworldly, as well as kind of shows a bit of a preview of the journey closer to the region of the Shrike and kind of how deep you're about to go. It like foreshadows this kind of unreturnable place.
Yeah.
So it's amazing for tone setting. And then the second story, like you learn a lot about the soldier, but then he does this thing at the end of that story where suddenly you see also mild spoiler warnings. I'm gonna kind of dance around this one, so it's not gonna be so explicit for anyone that wants to read it, but just spoiler warnings in general. There might be some stuff, but by the end of that story, you get more information about the Shrike in a way that sets a tone of almost helplessness, because you kind of see some of what the Shrike is capable of in a way
Yeah.
that suddenly it just reframes everything. It's like, oh, snap, this is not, I don't know, it's just
Yeah.
it reformats or reframes and changes the tone. I felt like every single story just had some thing of significance that added to the significance of where they're going, added to the tone in some way. You got some piece of world as well as some piece of character. There was some
Yeah.
key piece of context that I liked picking up on.
I think the first three stories in particular, like again, very subtle world building, but they kind of get major blocks in place.
Mm-hmm.
And then because of that, he was able to tell a much more grounded story for like the scholar story, and have this emotional arc for that one, because he
Very
didn't have to
true.
spend as much time expositing on the world. And I kind of felt like the last three stories benefited from all the world building having been done. They were able to, I really feel like they slotted into a world you'd already understood.
Yeah.
Whereas the first three were engaging because you were still learning so much about not just the characters, but the world that they were living in, and trying to piece together. Each of the stories has some relevance to Hyperion and the Shrike and stuff. So the first three have that intrigue, and then the last three are able to kind of exist a little bit more in a like established world.
Mm-hmm.
Which I really liked. Oh yeah, just on the point of when you kind of get that bit of detail about the Shrike and kind of how powerful it is, that sense of like the enemy being so overpowered.
Yeah.
I think he does that really well in a number of his books. In The Terror, for example, The Terror being a book in which these sailors are trying to cross the Northern Passage from, I think it's from England to like the bottom of India.
Mm-hmm.
So they're trying to find a way through like the Antarctic ice. So they're traveling in these big ice-breaking ships, but they end up leaving too late in the year, and essentially getting landlocked. So all the water around them is frozen. So these two ships just get landlocked in ice, and it's based on a true event. And he, what he does is he kind of starts the story when the characters have already been trapped here in the ice for, I think it's almost a year by the time we meet them.
Mm-hmm.
And they're running out of food, and they realize that there is something in the area that is trying to burrow down into the snow. They got to make its way into the ship, and they kind of know that there's polar bears in the area and stuff. So really terrifying idea of just being trapped in a ship with a giant predator outside, basically trying to get you. And the conditions that they live in are so fierce. It's like dark all the time. Taking your gloves off for a moment, even to kind of fit their hand into a shotgun or to turn on a lantern or anything, like they're thinking of frostbite just from that. But as that story develops, and he kind of shows the little polar bear, each time it gets at the characters, you kind of realize just how impossible it would be to realistically defend themselves against something like this, that it can just come and feed on them as it likes. which really built into like the sense of terror and fear in that story. In his other book, Carrion Comforts, I think he does one of the best like overpowered antagonists, like overpowered supernatural antagonists I've ever come across.
Oh my gosh.
It's so good. I think I would describe the book is basically about these beings which are essentially what I would just call mind vampires, where they essentially are able to use like telekinesis or kind of a psychotic or not psychotic, psychic ability to control human beings. And I think they can inhabit their bodies. I'm not sure if they were in their own bodies or if they could migrate to another thing's body.
Yeah.
But I remember them either being able to replenish their own body very quickly, or to migrate into another form. But they would essentially control your mind, and then kind of suck the life out of you, but through your mind. So they didn't even have to necessarily physically be in the same space as you, and they could, control multiple people. And I don't remember if they needed to make eye contact. I don't remember if it was that they needed to be able to see you to do it, or if they just needed to be in the vicinity. But they were essentially like, it just seemed like they were like a little hood, and they could control whatever was around them. So,
oh my gosh,
what the story is about is a handful of characters kind of stumble upon this discovery that these beings are operating in the world, and they've been sort of subtly feeding upon human beings while like controlling world events for many generations, and kind of influencing wars and influencing political things. So that point in the story where you have the characters be like, do we run? Do we like abandon, or do we try to do something about this? And I remember reading it being like, God, I would run. I wouldn't even it's such an impossible mountain that you're even like, how would you even begin trying to figure out how to climb that?
Yeah.
And even if you decided to run and hide, you're just hoping that it decides not to pursue you in any way, because if it pursues you, you're done.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember thinking like he's come up with a, you know what I mean? You normally wouldn't find characters facing such an impossible obstacle unless it was, I know we were talking about dystopian stories before. It felt like if you're trying to take down a mass government that had loads of control, and it just seems like such an impossible task. Just these characters trying to like either evade or in some way stand against these handful of beings that they've come into contact with. It just felt so impossible. So the character's fear and the character's trepidation, the character's uncertainty about how to proceed really rang true in that book. So I really liked that. That was the best part about that, was just how impossible and just how frightening the antagonist creatures seemed.
That's even you just describing that was a wild experience for me, because the antagonist that you described, it feels overpowered in a way where it feels like a kid came up with it, like where it was like a kid was competing with one of their friends and they were kind of one-upping each other. It's like, well, my vampire can control everyone's minds and do all this. And it felt like that level of overpowered, where it's like there's no regulation. It's just like it's got the power in it.
Yeah.
Then so you describe that monster, I'm like, wow, that is an overpowered monster. That's wild. And then when you switched into describing what the story, so it's like what the story is about is these people that discover this. I had this, suddenly it became, it felt so cool. I don't know. It's like, oh my gosh, there are people in this story. Like there's a story here. Like it's wild to think of someone telling a story about that would be interesting, where you have a character overpowered on this level, and then you need to explore the human condition within that container.
Yeah.
That's wild. Especially an author as well written as Dan Simmons exploring that would be very cool, I imagine.
Definitely. Yeah. Like, would you feel like if you were to come up with an antagonist like that, you would just be like, oh, there's no story there because it's just going to win every time, you know what I mean? You have to build in some kind of fatal weakness. Like I remember thinking when I was reading it, that it seemed really overpowered from the perspective of the characters as they were going through that story.
Mm-hmm.
But as they go along, you kind of realize that the characters have various powers and it has various weaknesses, and that's how that story plays out. But you, as a writer, you almost have to build in those passages to success for your characters, and your characters have to kind of find that. So just throwing them up against something which is overwhelmingly just got to wreck them at every turn and every opportunity is going to be flawed, or like not flawed but flaunted. And that's just such a good story because of that.
Yeah, it's like I guess also it depends on what you're going for, because it's like, well, you don't have to build in a weakness if you want to just explore someone butting up again. Like the okay, mild spoiler for Hyperion. Very, very mild, but it's information. The Shrike doesn't really have a weakness. They never really talk about it. It's just like kind of treated as this elemental being that they are going to go see. And it's like, yeah, basically they are just gonna go die more or less for what they're for as far as the reader knows.
Yeah,
Um, because yeah, the more you learn, the more you just learn that it is kind of a fairly impenetrable, fairly omnipotent being. And you just kind of it doesn't have weaknesses. You never entertain the idea that they're going to outsmart it, outthink it, out whatever it. So I like it from that perspective because it's not about them overcoming the Shrike. It is just about them. Um, the Shrike
yeah,
really isn't even an antagonist. It actually is just a force in the story. It doesn't
yeah.
read as an antagonist. Just to
It's
clarify
not
for
presented as like a dragon that needs to be slain. It's
yeah,
presented as something you're going to go and meet, and whatever it decides is going to be what happens. Yeah,
yeah. But it almost feels like the story Carrion that was Carrion Comforts.
Carrion Comforts. Yeah,
Yeah. It feels the opposite of Dracula to me because Dracula was, I loved that book. I had a great time reading it. There are some really cool, and it has a very cool atmosphere to it.
yeah,
And I really do like it's a story told through letters and written reports and like actual like found literature, I guess you could call it. But that story it's also kind of silly in a way because it's supposed to be, it's Dracula. It's this big vampire, very powerful, all this stuff. But that guy is just riddled with weaknesses where it's
yeah.
like oh, he can't cross moving water, and during the day he is immobile and undefended within his coffin and like all these
Yeah.
stuff. And it to the point, and as well as like over time humans have adapted Dracula so many times and the story has changed a bit to where vampiric transformation is quicker or whatever it is. But in Dracula, it's a fairly slow process of transformation, and it requires multiple bites and multiple. It's like a slow transfusion of blood as opposed to like he bit you, now you're a vampire sort of thing, or something like that. But the point being is like that one felt like they had so many weaknesses, or the vampire had so many weaknesses to the point where it felt like they defeated him like through the power of a good old English reasoning. I don't know. Like there's so many times that was the most
Yes,
British
that's it.
book
Yeah,
ever. Like
yeah. Yeah, it was the deduction of where he is now, kind of.
yes, we
Yeah.
can sit down and we can reason this out. We've tracked his traveling patterns and we'll start
Oh,
with
it's
a
so true.
good breakfast. And Dr. I
Van
forget his
Helsing.
name, Van Helsing here.
Yeah.
Well, he's like a master of deduction, and
Yeah, yeah,
and so they've reasoned him out, and we've got him.
yeah.
And yeah, I love that book, but at a certain point that started to feel silly because there's certain points where like some of their big wins was that someone transposed all of their collective information into one readable document that was easy to share. And I was
Yeah,
like, I mean,
yeah,
that's great. Like, that's a great meta accomplishment. Like, it's good to have your information organized, but it doesn't really help you with a vampire situation.
yeah, yeah.
But it did. I don't know.
No, that's true. It's kind of like he lost the chess game of moving about, and
Hmm.
they caught him when he was weak. That's the kind of all it was. It wasn't like a big wasn't necessarily a big reckoning with a force of evil or a big destructive force. It was just like, no, you'll be on this road at this time.
Hmm. And it really
Yeah.
felt like I guess it felt like an older story in that way because it really did feel like you have to wake up pretty early in the morning to get one over on
Yeah.
an
Old
Englishman.
Dracula.
Yeah, like yeah. So great story, but just very different from what you described, where it's like, all right, well, let's actually take a force that's almost insurmountable and see what the humans like, how the human reaction or the human condition changes.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a scene where a SWAT team enters a building and everyone just gets devastated. So it kind of
Yeah.
establishes that, like, these regular characters just by themselves aren't going to be enough. You're not going to be able to go in guns blazing on this one. So
No. Do they I'm okay for this to be spoiled. I'm just very curious. How do they like how do they find out that this thing is going on? Or how do they discover these
um,
beings?
so one of the characters is a Holocaust survivor, and during
Mm,
his time in the camps, he is essentially put into a situation where he meets one of the, if I remember correctly, he is essentially used in a what is essentially a game of chess,
mm,
between one of these things and another one of these things, where he is just being made to move forwards a block, and then this other one is moving someone forwards a block and forwards a block, and when they meet, whichever piece is the chess piece that is taking the other chess piece just kills the other chess piece.
whoa.
Um, so he is in that, but manages to escape. But he knows then for the rest of his life that these things exist. So he's like the researcher type character who's been, he's got the wall of pages on all the notes
Yeah,
and he's
yeah.
tracked them down. And then I think the other two characters just come across it as a result of a murder, which isn't a murder. It's, these beings, like they have their own politics and their own games that are going on within their community. So one of
Mm,
them is kind of double crossing another, and the one that is double crossed sort of has to take flight and ends up killing a man or a number of people along the way. So the cop that is investigating this and the daughter of the victim, they end up kind of meeting and doing a little bit of an investigating. And at some point, this researcher contacts them, and I think they all kind of stumble into getting on this thing's radar, more or less, by just kind of following the breadcrumbs. But that's what ends up happening. So they end up on the radar of this thing, which is obviously this force of benevolence
not
or
a
benevolence, yeah, of malevolence, and
malevolent,
then
yeah.
yeah. So that's how I don't remember exactly how the three of them meet, but that's the different ways that the characters come across it. And it really feels like you've walked through a door that you would love to be able to just back out of. It's very good. It's yeah, Hyperion, The Terror, and Carrion Comforts are my three favorite of his, so I'd recommend checking it out.
I will check that out. I'm gonna continue the Dan Simmons train and check that one out too. Oh, dang it. I wanted to say something, but I forgot what it was. Oh, it's wild. Like, I feel like because we just did the dystopian episode, and we had that little bit where we were talking about dystopian impacting people more than horror, and we kind of played with the dystopian horror genre, or like kind of like played with mixing those genres a little bit. This feels like exactly that. It's like it is almost a dystopian world that it
Yeah,
has horror elements, and it's kind of that thing we were talking about where it's like the government or the dystopian societal force they're attacking is as monster, like that sort of thing. I was
yeah,
like,
yeah,
it's just wild that I feel like we just talked about this. I'm like, oh man, this is more or less what I felt like I had in my mind.
yeah, yeah. That's definitely what it feels like. Yeah, just the insurmountable, not just the odds, but the fact that it can get into everything. Like how do you? It's like trying to put out a fire that like you can't see. Just out of curiosity, which of the stories in Hyperion was your favorite, or maybe which of the characters was your favorite?
I don't know if I would say he's my favorite character, but my favorite story was the Scholar's story. That
Yeah,
one was
same. Yeah,
so oh, very heartbreaking tragedy, but just like human heartbreaking, where it's just
yeah,
like it didn't feel like it's like shoved in your face, like, isn't this sad? But it is just like you just feel it, and yeah, satisfying, but also so sad. And I felt like everyone kind of in the story has a feel like they have a different reaction to his story than they do to other stories, where that one ends and everyone's just kind of quiet for a while and just like, oh. I would say that one and the priest's story were my favorite.
nice. Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely found that one my favorite story. I also think that was my favorite character. And I really
Hmm.
liked how I feel like he was the most intriguing from like the get go because he
Yeah.
seemed different and he was the character who was quietest, so he left you wondering
Yeah.
all the time what was going on with him.
Also, he has a
But yeah,
baby. And it's like, why
he
is
has a
this guy
baby.
got a
Just
baby with him? Yeah.
it explicitly was kind of like, why are you taking a baby into this environment?
Yeah.
It's like, what's going on? So you kind of knew it was some kind of tragedy there. So yeah, I remember yeah, just being really engaged and like really feeling like, is this story going to be able to live up to the hype that I've given it just by wanting to get to this character story?
Mm,
And I absolutely thought it did. And it's maybe quite interested in tragedy as a genre since, because I know tragedy
mm.
is very popular, but obviously very difficult to pull off correctly. So I've been interested in like reading a bit more tragedy and trying to figure out how to how to write a good tragedy, how to nail a good tragedy.
Mm.
My second favorite was probably the soldier story, just because I thought he had two
Ah.
phenomenal action scenes in that one.
Mhm.
Kind of the opening scene where he's in a war, and then the later scene where he's a kind of, won't give spoilers, but this is the big thing that happens in space and stuff,
Yeah.
which I just thought was
I
brilliant.
love that as a distillation. It's like, I won't give spoilers, but this is the big thing that happens in space. Welcome to a sci-fi book. Like, there's the big thing that happens in space.
Yeah.
That's a pretty safe one to say.
Yeah, both of those action scenes I've kind of taken, and I just have them on my laptop just as pieces of text. Both of them are broken into like the hero's journey from start to finish.
Yeah.
The phase which is like the character not quite committing to what's going on, and then something happens that is like almost the mentor moment where he kind of is like, oh, now I have to get involved. And then there's kind of a period where like, oh, this is the meat of what's happening, and then here's the crisis, and here's the. So I was like, oh, that's a really interesting way of thinking about how to structure an interesting action scene, or an engaging action scene that has like a narrative flow to it that feels like it has good pace. So that's just a little trick if anyone is trying to put together an action scene themselves.
Yeah.
And I've noticed he did the same in Carrion Comfort, and one of the big scenes in that was it's structured like it's almost structured like a little story itself.
Wow.
With a kind of try-fail cycle, but within a larger hero's journey where like the character is like a false victory, and they have like going into the cave, and they kind of have to like gather their resources and make one last effort and stuff like that. So he does action. I think he writes action very well.
Yeah. Now I want to take another look at that action. I know the scene you're talking about. And I want to take another look at it. The other thing that was great about the soldier story is it's like the poet story, you get a look at a lot of the sort of world general population technology, like how the very wealthy are living, and like all you get that sort of flavor. And then in the soldier story, you get a look at the military technology, and like you get those pieces of world building, how the major governing force works a little bit, and a bit more like that, which was cool. The tragedy, the scholar's story, I just like felt it so much, and I just thought I thought it was so beautiful. Also, I love literary fiction, and that one reads a little bit more like literary fiction.
Yeah.
But then the priest story was, I haven't felt in a while like that drive to just like, I need to keep reading. Like, I haven't felt that in so long, because there's just so much intrigue, so much of just like what the heck is going on? Like, this is the most bizarre thing. I have some theories, I guess, but I don't even really know. But like, what is happening? This is weird. And he did such a good job of like not putting anything that was super scary.
Obvious.
Yeah,
Oh,
super
scary.
obvious,
Yeah.
or super like in your face scary. It was more on the side of like unsettling. It was like there's something off, like
Yeah.
off-putting about what's going on, and that just the whole time is just something is off.
Yeah.
And there's that little thing of like, it's like something's off, and oh, also there's a little door over there that you can't go in. What's behind that door? And it's like, oh God, what's going on?
Yeah.
So
And the
good.
character is sort of like, you know what I mean? He's doing a little bit of digging, and you're kind of like, don't dig, man. Don't.
Yeah.
Can you not feel what I feel? Get out of here.
How are you not clocking this? Yeah. Also, I love just this is something that H.P. Lovecraft does very well as well, is just like I said before, is that story gives it kind of gives a preview to the journey, the pilgrim's journey that they're going on, because it shows you kind of a little bit of the journey across Hyperion, because he gets closer to where the Shrike is, which is where the characters on the pilgrimage are going. And also the priest story is told first, so it's before they've even landed on Hyperion. So it is like on their journey to Hyperion, the reader gets a little sneak preview of kind of what they're in for when they get there. But he does such a good job of just highlighting how deep into kind of uncivilized territory he goes. Like, there is a sense of you can't simply just go back. So it adds this pressure by showing like he's kind of gone to an uncharted place, and he does that really good setup of slowly moving further and further and further away out of society until he's in this place, and you really feel very far removed from, I don't know, any sense of normalcy. So there's this sense of going deeper and passing a point of no return, kind of. It's very reminiscent of H.P. Lovecraft for me. He does a lot of like, sure, you go into the forest, but then you go to that one place that's a little bit deeper and you find that place that hasn't been seen, the existential sensation of being in a place that probably hasn't been looked at by human eyes for thousands of years or something. Like that sort of, he likes to take it there. And I felt like this kind of did that as well.
That story was also, that one in particular is journal entries.
Yeah.
So and even narratively, it's got that feeling of, you're kind of getting the events after they've occurred. So you're kind of in between each gap, you're kind of like, what's happened since the last entry kind of thing. And then you're getting filled in on, this is what's happened since the last thing I said was happening. So I love that. Yeah. It gives it that sense of like, I'm going to go do something tomorrow. And then the next day it's like, oh, I'm so rattled. It's like, oh God, what happened in between?
Yeah.
This and that. It's got that flow to it, which helps a lot as well.
That's wild about journal entry stories, because the whole story is told retrospectively, which I guess, a lot of people tell stories in past tense and stuff, but it really is like, it's the reader coming in and be like, what happened? Tell me. Like you've already done the thing that we've been planning together in your journal.
Yeah. What you lose in the overall, this is happening now, you can gain back in little bursts of something terrible has happened since I last spoke to you, kind of sense, which works quite well on the small scale for pacing. So yeah.
Did you say that in a different episode that he was inspired by H.P. Lovecraft? Or he was someone he read?
I definitely think my observation is that he was very much inspired by Stephen King.
Okay.
And I know Stephen King was heavily influenced by Lovecraft, and I always see kind of a flow between them. I guess if I was to sit back and look at modern horror, I feel like I can see the flow from one into the next. Like I think Stephen King took a lot of Lovecraftian concepts, but then wrote about them from the perspective of like really leaned into the characters. I think Stephen King has character dynamics. Whereas Lovecraft, he didn't do characters very well. I really try to, I think. Yeah. Stephen King like this very character focused thing with these same kind of horror ideas, but he pushes those horror ideas kind of way into the back, and you kind of discover it later on.
Right.
And I kind of feel like certainly in his horror stuff, Dan Simmons, you get a real feel of, I don't know how I describe it. It's something very Stephen King-esque, certainly in I can't remember the names of them, but there's one story which is set in a school, more or less, in a small town in America, where there's there's something that's living under the school, basically, and I think it's taking the children, feeding the children, or something like that. Yeah. But it has this real feel of, it's very reminiscent of a couple of Stephen King stories. It's got a little bit of it and a little bit of a little bit of it and a little bit of that. No, it's got a little bit of it. And
Stephen King sequel, that.
Kind of a Salem's Lot kind of thing. So I can see that he kind of approached the kind of American horror story in a lot of the same ways. Although I don't think he was ever as good at that kind of horror story as Stephen King. I still feel like I can see the influence there.
That's actually, when you were describing that story, I thought you were describing a Stephen King story. It sounded very it's cool to see that sort of lineage of authors and who people take influence from, because I know H.P. Lovecraft took inspiration from Poe. He read a lot of Poe, as well as Dan Simmons.
Algernon Blakewood as well. Algernon Blakewood has one or two stories which feel like, I can imagine a young H.P. Lovecraft having read this and then it launching his entire everything Lovecraftian. Feels like it came from like The Willows, or one or two of Algernon Blakewood's kind of weird stories.
What's Algernon and Blakewood?
Algernon Blakewood or Blackwood. He wrote one of my favorite of his is The Willows, but The Willows ends up getting into a cosmic kind of territory, which came out years before H.P. Lovecraft wrote any kind of cosmic horror.
You've talked about The Willows a number of times. That's one I've been meaning to read. It sounds awesome.
That is a short one. That's a 20K short one.
Ah, okay. A
Not
little
tricking
baby.
you into reading another 300,000 words.
It's amazing that if it's 20,000 words into 60 chapters, like what is this? The oh, that's cool. But also, so Lovecraft took influence from Poe, and Dan Simmons took very heavy influence from Poe as well. I noticed in
Okay.
The Terror, he did something I've never seen before, which was very cool, where he fully just like in this chapter, I'm gonna fully recreate one of Poe's stories. And he fully like took the same tension beat. He recreated the entire thing. He actually, well, I mean, really, like, it's when they have the party on the ice, and there's
Yes.
the different rooms
Costume.
made up. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's based on I forget the name of it, but it's a Poe story slash poem. I think I'm not sure if it's in when Poe writes it, it's about a plague.
Okay.
And then the rich and wealthy lock themselves in a castle to be separated from it, and it's the same
Okay.
thing. You have the rooms. Every room is a different color, and at the end, like they kind of tour through the rooms, and at the end, there's this black room that's nobody's partying in that room for some reason, and there's a clock, and it's like very like ooh. So he literally does that same thing. And I know, but he does it in a way where it's like he's kind of it's an homage, I guess, but like
Yeah.
the justification for that and that is that one of the sailors had read this thing in a newspaper and wanted to base the party off of that, so it is like a themed party based off of Poe's poem, and they're just not name dropping Poe. I can't remember if he actually a few chapters later when they're talking about the party name drops, and I was like, oh, whatever. But as I was reading, I was like, oh snap, like I know
Yeah. Yeah.
this. I know this.
That's
Uh,
trippy. I didn't get that at all. Yeah. That's so cool.
that was a moment where I felt particularly well read. I was like, look at me
Yeah.
pulling out I know what he's doing here. I've read this. I know the source material. That was cool. I got I have a Poe, someone adapted a number of Poe's poems into sort of a graphic novel format and compiled them. And
Oh,
it's
cool.
so cool. So I have that.
Did you watch The Fall of the House of Usher?
No,
Hmm.
but I've heard of it.
It's each episode I think is a Poe. I think I'm pretty sure each episode is a Poe poem or inspired by a Poe poem.
Hmm.
Um, I guess I didn't think it was great. I thought the first two episodes were really good, and I didn't think it kind of continued to be good all the way through.
Oh yeah.
But I was enjoying like each Poe reference kind of in each episode. So I was like, oh, that's different, a bit fun.
That is cool. Oh
Yeah.
man, I think my dad just told me he was like, "You like Poe, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do." That's weird that you said that though, because we've never spoken about this actually. Well, I feel pretty satisfied. I think that's it's coming to an end there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So this time instead of we normally give a quote at the end of these things, we thought, well, it is a quote, but it's just a quote specifically from a Dan Simmons book. It is from Hyperion, this one, right?
This one is from Hyperion, yeah, and I'm almost certain it's from the poet story. It feels like the poet story.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is prison always has been a good place for writers, killing as it does the twin demons of nobility and diversion.
Yeah. Mobility and diversion. So, if you haven't read or listened to Dan Simmons, we both highly recommend it. He's definitely in my top 5 favorite authors now.
Nice.
Incredibly well written, incredibly versatile. The scope the ability to just pull a genre out of a hat and just nail it, or like the breadth of his toolbox is so incredibly wide. Um, I feel very like safe in his hands as an author, and I just have a lot of respect for. Part of me feels safe because I have so much for respect because I feel like I'm with someone who takes the craft so seriously, and it's like I'm gonna do this and I'm gonna do it well, and that's just kind of what I feel when I'm reading him, and he really puts the care in. You can see his passion for writing in his writing with just how good it is, and that has me want to be with him even more in that and like give him the time and the my attention.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, if you've enjoyed previous episodes or whatever it is, don't be afraid to give us a like and a review down below. That would mean a lot. And to all those who have been tuning in to all the various episodes as we've been recording over this last, I don't know, year and a half, 2 years. I don't even remember. Thanks for listening. It's nice talking to you every week when we put these out. And if you haven't already gotten a copy of the new Mythic, we highly recommend it. Especially, if you have read Hyperion and you like a collection of short stories. This isn't exactly a shared world, but it's a collection of short stories spanning a number of genres, some horror elements, sci-fi, fantasy. You're bound to find something you like in there. It's been nominated for a couple of awards. People are loving it when they pick it up. So we recommend you doing that. And if you do read it, give that a review as well. And if you want to listen to it, it's actually out on as an audiobook as well, with incredible voice talent that you can have read these stories to you. One of which being Rupert Degas does Ali Burnham's story. If you're unfamiliar with him, he reads The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, which is an incredible performance as well. If you haven't checked that out as well, I highly recommend it. So it's a great listen if you haven't picked that up yet or are kind of looking for another audiobook or anything like that. I do, I'm biased, I'm one of the authors on the project, but it is very good. I do believe in the project and I recommend it to pick it up, give that a rate and review as well, because it just helps us keep going. It's encouraging and helps us get ourselves out there, which, we're all trying to do. It's a podcast by emerging writers for emerging writers. We're emerging. So we'd greatly appreciate that. Thank you once again for tuning in. And we'll talk to you next time. See you later.
Bye.
Goodbye.
You're listening to Prose and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.